Thank you. Today is a Gandhi Jayanti. It's Mahatma Gandhi's 149th birth anniversary, and one of his memorable quotes was that there's enough in the world for man's need, but not enough for man's greed. I was idly reflecting on what Gandhi would have thought if he had read the Billionaire Raj, and I suspect he would appreciate that it was written, but he would be somewhat disturbed by its contents. Anyway, welcome to this latest panel discussion on James Crabtree's book, The Billionaire Raj. I say latest because I think there have been 10 before this all over the world. He's been to Sydney most recently, then there was in London, in New York, in, of course, India, more than once. So this is the last, not the last, but the latest of many panel discussions. I should add that the book has made the shortlist of the FT McKinsey's Business Book of the Year, which itself is quite an achievement. So it's obviously had an enormous impact around the world. So it's really appropriate that we sit down and discuss this in Singapore at this institute. Well, in my own review of the book for the Straits Times, I was broadly very positive, but I had one mild criticism that the book basically covered the tycoons who were guilty of excess and flamboyance. It didn't cover many of the billionaires like Ratan Tata or Narayan Murthy or Dilip Shangvi or some of the more straight-laced people who are also billionaires who haven't been as flamboyant as the characters in the book, as you'll find out. But I think there's a good reason for James's selective sampling. It is that these people and their stories were able to bring out the three fault lines that you just saw in the video. That is the inequality, the corruption, the cronyism, and the boom and bust cycles. So I think he used these characters as a means to tell this broader story, and that's where I'd like this discussion to go, to some of these broader topics. So having said that, well, let's proceed. I think the routine that we've been suggested is as follows. You will have a presentation by James for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have reactions from our very distinguished panelists. I should underline distinguished panelists because Mr. Vinod Rai, who was also interviewed for the book, was one of India's most famous and distinguished civil servants, served as Auditor General of India at a very interesting time. And Dr. Kudaisya is an economic historian, and I think can bring a historical perspective to bear on many of the issues that this book covers. So, James, over to you first.
Thank you. So that's very kind. I owe all sorts of debts of gratitude to this panel. As I said, this is not the first time that I have roped Vikram into doing something around the book, and so he has, with exceptional good humor, agreed to come and do another turn, and so I'm grateful, not just for the very kind write-up you gave me in the Straits Times, although that was very nice, but also for the sort of intelligent engagement that you've given with the book. It's very nice to meet a sort of fellow, well, I'm not a proper professor, I'm a kind of pretend professor, but to meet a distinguished NUS professor, and so I'm looking forward to our interaction. But it's a particular pleasure to be on a panel with Vinod, who appears in the book. There is a passage in the book set upstairs on the 8th floor or the 9th floor, wherever your office is. And I suppose, so I moved to India in 2011, and I lived there for 5 years. And initially, I suppose, what kind of captivated me about the place as somebody who had grown up in the UK and studied in the US was the in a sense, the tycoons, the billionaires of the book, who are a form of industrial actor that if you grow up in the industrialized parts of the world, in the West in particular, you don't know them very well. And so when I first moved to Mumbai, kind of getting to grips with Mr. Ambani, Mr. Malia, Mr. Adani, this was sort of very fascinating to a newcomer to India. But very quickly, I arrived in 2011, which in a sense was still the throes of the season of scams. It was only a couple of months after I arrived, I think. When did the Supreme Court cancel all of the 2G licenses? Early 2012, I think. And so although the early rumblings of some of the corruption scandals that characterized India under its previous government, some of them had just begun, but in a sense the major public actions, particularly by Mr. Rai as Auditor General, had only just begun when I arrived. And so I caught the tail end of the India Against Corruption movement. I remember one day going up early in the morning to go and watch Anna Hazare as he made a small pilgrimage to the statue of Gandhi on Juhu Beach in the north of Mumbai. And then you had, after all of the hoo-ha over the 2G scam, the coal scam, all the rest of them. And so in a sense I was there watching this, not simply the kind of challenge of a certain model of capitalism, some would call it crony capitalism, but also the challenges of governance that the sort of the good bits of India's public administration were trying to bring. And so in a sense the book, as a journalist, the temptation is always to have a kind of clear morality play, and so I suppose in a sense this is a book of kind of goodies and baddies, and most of the billionaires that Vikram is quite right, I picked billionaires who were typically baddies, or at least those who had racier reputations, but there are also good guys who tended to be, kind of crusading bureaucrats generally, of whom Mr. Rai was one, Raghuram Rajan was another, and so there are a range of characters who I tried to profile in the book to give a sense of how the sort of the light side of the Indian system, the forces of transparency and accountability and progressive political reform, orchestrated something of a fight back. And in a sense, this battle is still going on. So, that's just to say that it's very nice of you to come and do this, and so thank you for being helpful in the book, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion about its themes. That video sort of went off a little bit flat. It's meant to have a pumping Bollywood soundtrack, which for some reason you couldn't hear, so that when you see the little Mukesh Ambani waving at you, this is all orchestrated to music, but at least you should have got a gist of the three themes of the book. So I'll just give you a kind of canter through those. I suspect we may spend more time on the second theme. Typically, people are more interested, I have found, in giving this presentation in the first theme, namely the rise of the super rich and the billionaires and the inequality that has come with it. I think maybe for this audience, perhaps we may want to talk about the nature of crony capitalism in India and whether or not it has declined and how it relates to growth and that sort of thing. But anyway, so that I profile using these characters. As I say, this is perhaps unlike some of the books that the more scholarly authors who come here. This is a book that aspires to be found on a 3-for-2 table in an airport bookstore, and it's currently, I found out this morning, someone sent me, still the number 2 book in Delhi airport, which is rather pleasing. But through these characters, I tried to sort of tease out some slightly more theoretical subjects. So one of which was the nature of inequality in early industrializing societies, I suppose is how you'd put it. And so you saw the graph in the video. I looked in particular at the wealth that was created in India, not just after reforms in 1991, but particularly the argument in the book is that what really changed in the middle of the 2000s, about 2004, 2005. You can date that whenever you like. I cheekily date it to Vijay Mallya's 50th birthday party. but at some point around that time, that was when you had the openness that India had achieved after 1991 somehow reintegrated with the peak of a certain form of globalization. This was the height of the Great Moderation. It was the run into the Beijing Olympics. It was the time of the commodity supercycle. And so the story sometimes that is told about India and its own economic growth, which is one that is related to domestic reforms, I think misses the kind of bigger picture, which is in a sense India reopened just at the time that the global economy was going bananas. And it was the combination of those things that began to create extraordinary wealth. This is not an original distinction. This is something that Ruchir Sharma in his book came up with. But in a sense, you can see this as a division between, wealth that has been well and properly made and wealth that has some component of illegality or kind of collusion about it, the good billionaires and the bad. But certainly the quantity of wealth created at the top of India's economy has been enormous. And while there's a sort of rather unhelpful discussion about the relative performance of sort of the lot of those at the bottom, India has a much better record on the reduction of absolute poverty than it is often given credit for. But there's no particular contradiction between saying that that is true and that inequality in all sorts of ways has increased. And so the rise in the number of billionaires is a kind of metaphor for this. But whichever way you cut the data, whether it's in terms of wealth or income, consumption, spatial inequality between the south and west of the country and the north, urban and rural, inequality is increasing very quickly. And in the book, I make a number of arguments why reasonable people should care about this. And in a sense, my background is I'm a business journalist. I used to work for Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. I have no particular problem with markets. I have no particular problem with people getting rich as long as they did it by setting up competitive companies and by exporting, building businesses in the manner of some of the more salubrious billionaires that Vikram and a number of other people have mentioned that I didn't cover very closely in the book. And this was partly because these people are just rather less interesting than the racier ones. But it seems to me that particularly sitting here in Singapore, which is where I left India in 2016 and I came here on a sort of sabbatical which then became permanent to write the book, that it gives you a good perspective sitting here as to why you might care about inequality from a developmental perspective, namely that most of the successful economies of East and Southeast Asia that managed to make this very rapid journey from poverty to middle income status and beyond did so with levels of inequality that are far lower than India has at the moment. And the risk is that if India's levels of inequality continue on the same path for the next 10 or 15 years as they have for the last 10 or 15 years, then you're in a really unprecedented situation, Brazil-esque Latin American levels of inequality, even if reasonable people can disagree about the measures. And indeed, reasonable people do disagree fiercely and at length about the nature of inequality in India and which data is appropriate. It seems to me that the trend is only heading in one direction, and without some sort of remedial action, the risk is it's going to get much worse. So that's fault line number one. And then you have two more. So the second is the one that most directly relates to Vinod's work as Auditor General, which is the kind of nature of crony capitalism in India. And one of the kind of great joys of a book like this was I got to go and try and find out how did some of these scams really happen. Now, obviously, that was his job as Auditor General, but I also got to kind of rootle around and try and...
It was not a job to make the scams happen.
No, to discover how they happened.
As long as you should disclaimer, it's all right.
You were trying to find out how these people had actually done it, and I was trying to do the same thing. But again, the same phenomenon is at play here, I think, basically, which is that, in a sense, the reglobalization of India's economy was behind a lot of the move from what I call the shift from retail to wholesale corruption in India. So there's been corruption of sorts in India since the pre-reform era. Everybody knows this. Anyone who has grown up there will tell you you have to pay, whatever it might be, 50 rupees to a policeman or to get a marriage certificate. But what began to happen in the years preceding the wave of scandals that hit the country in the middle of the 2000s and the latter half of the 2000s was that public resources of the sort that the Auditor General was looking into suddenly became vastly more valuable. Iron ore, which was part of one scam in Goa and Karnataka, became vastly valuable because it could be exported to China and the global price was going through the roof. Telecom spectrum became vastly more valuable, partly because you had lots of foreign money coming into telecoms, and this is also sort of related to the growth of a global industry and set of technologies. The coal price is also related to this. I mean, in a sense, a lot of what Indian companies were doing was linked at some fundamental level to the re-globalization of the Indian economy. And so in the book, I dig into a little bit how these things happen, what were the tricks that were pulled, and how, I mean, this is a sort of fairly well-known story now, I think, in a sense, how for all of its sometimes faults, one of the positive factors in India's democracy and judicial system was the very strong reaction to these scandals as they emerged, partly through the election of Narendra Modi in 2014, partly through judicial activism, partly through transparency in audit bodies, and partly through civil society. And I think we can have a kind of reasonable discussion about, do we think it's possible that something like this could happen again? Have these types of scandals now being kind of committed to history or not? And that leads on to the third fault line, which I call the boom and bust cycle of India's industrial economy. In a sense, I don't know that I picked that partly because it was a phrase of my old boss, Gordon Brown. He always used to talk about boom and bust. And I suppose what I mean by that is that India's aspiration has always been to try and achieve a growth path that is similar to China, sort of 8-10% in perpetuity. But actually, while you look at while India's top-line growth over recent years, over the last 5 years, has been very positive, much of that is driven, in fact, almost all of it is driven by consumption and public investment, industrial investment of the sort of thing that you need to do when you're an economy that has a GDP per capita of $1,700-1,800, has been far, far below historical trends. It sort of fell off a cliff about the time, or in the aftermath of the financial crisis and before Modi's election, and has never really recovered. And in a very simple sense, what happened was that it used to be in India that capital was very expensive and politics was relatively easy. The sort of political system was malleable to the will of industrialists, and in part because of the kind of things that Vinod and others did. In a sense, the opposite has now turned out to be true, that capital is easier to get hold of than it used to be. Capital in India is still expensive. I mean, the cost of capital is still high, but it's not as kind of crazy high as it used to be, particularly in a pre-reform era, but even 10 years ago. Easier to get hold of investment capital, and that was certainly true during the Great Moderation, but politics has become much more difficult. And so the old model by which a generation of industrial tycoons built roads and steel mills and open mines and all of the things that you want to do has ceased to work, and that has meant that the backbone of India's industrial economy has ceased to, or not entirely ceased to, but has substantially ceased to invest. And so these are three, I mean, there are all sorts of challenges that you see in India's growth and development model. You have problems of manufacturing and whether or not India can follow China and the rest of East Asia in an intensive manufacturing, export-led growth model. You have urbanization and a staggering 400 million people moving from villages to towns over the next 20 or 30 years. You have climate change, which is one of, I thought, the more kind of reasonable criticisms of a book like this, that I don't really mention climate change. And in a sense, all of us have an enormous stake in India developing along a less carbon-intensive growth path. But these three things that I mentioned, the three fault lines of very high levels of inequality that have come with the creation of a new super-rich class, a still kind of unsolved problem of crony capitalism that we can go into a little bit more in discussion, and then this tendency of the Indian economy to industrialize through fits and starts that have come along with the fact that, in a sense, the old model of industrial growth is broken, but there hasn't really been a new one set up to replace it. These are necessary conditions, I think you could argue, for India to develop rapidly, as the countries of East Asia and Southeast Asia have done. And I think it's an interesting moment, I mean, just to kind of bring us right up to date, it is an interesting moment to consider this. There was a period, in fact, I think it was almost 2 years ago now when I probably came to talk to you in your office, Vinod, that it almost seemed as if, writing a book about sort of crony capitalism in India almost felt a tiny bit like an anachronism. The sort of admirers of Mr. Modi would say, well, this is all a facet of history, and since 2014, much of this is being put right. Both the Prime Minister has read the Riot Act to his ministers and to the tycoons, but also at a deeper level, there are certain kinds of reforms, putting government processes online and that sort of thing, which are gradually going to sort of create a business environment that is pro-market rather than pro-business, and create a regulatory environment that is less kind of gameable to influence. And so it's interesting that right now, crony capitalism in India is having a bit of a resurgence, not just because of the potentially career-ending scandal, I think, over the French fighter jets. But you look at a whole range of different sort of scandals that have broken in the last, sort of 6 months or a year, which ask rather searching questions about still the relationship between business and government. I mean, there have been some highly admired companies like Infosys that have had governance scandals. There's a lot of problems emerging in the banking system. In a sense, I have a chapter in the book about the banking system, and I think that the banking reform is one of the areas in which Mr. Modi's government have one of the weakest records. I think it's fair to argue that India's banking system is less healthy now than it was when Modi took office. And so you've had a number of scandals in the last couple of weeks of financial institutions that have been revealed effectively to be bankrupt, one of which has had to be rescued, a lot of which relate to the kind of go-go years that happened prior to the financial crisis that I detail in the book. So I think there's fortunately for me and unfortunately for India, a lot of these issues are actually rather more current than many people thought, that those who were optimistic and thought that India had managed to put this era that I call the Billionaire Raj behind it, I think there's evidence to suggest that this is going to be a much more ongoing struggle. And I will leave it there, except to say one thing, which is I suppose I say at the end of the book that I feel this is a sort of an optimistic book. And in this respect, I haven't mentioned the comparison that I draw between India today and the United States in the latter half of the 19th century, the Gilded Age and India's new Gilded Age. And I suppose the more I looked into the history of this, the more sort of persuaded I became that even if you have a fairly gloomy view about some of the problems that India faces now, they are certainly no greater than the problems that were faced by the United States in 1880 or South Korea in 1965 or Singapore in 1965 for all that matter. And that through my old boss, when I worked for the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in the UK, used to say that people radically overestimate what governments can do in the very short term, but underestimate what they can do in the long term. And that through a kind of combination of natural factors like urbanization and then progressive political reforms, these more successful countries, by creating highly functioning markets, by asserting the control of the middle classes over politics, by developing state capacity in particular, which is one of the concluding sort of aspects of the book, they were able to bring about economic and political transformations in under a generation. And I see no particular reason why India, with the talent at its disposal, should not be able to do that. But in order to do that, I think the types of fault lines I talk about in the book are the things that need to be challenged. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, James. Well, I hope you'll be able to persuade us to be more optimistic about India when we're done with this discussion. But for now, we'll have an insider's view from Mr. Vinod Rai on the book and the issues it raises. Thanks.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you, James, for giving me a guest appearance in your production, which is the book. Though I find that you have given the star casting to Mr. Mukesh Ambani, and probably his house more than Mr. Mukesh Ambani himself. Antilla gets a lot of reference in the book, and has in some ways become a representative of the Indian burgeoning billionaire class. If we have to look at issues as have arisen in India over the last decade and a half, we need to go back to the turn of the millennium. How did cronyism in India develop? And how did things go wrong, start going wrong at least? Because at the turn of the millennium, India had come to terms with a coalition government which was doing pretty well. We were knocking on the doors of double-digit growth. Infrastructure was growing, telecom, and the golden quadrilateral scheme, as you know, of Prime Minister Bajpayee those days of developing national highways was doing exceedingly well. And just about towards the end of his government, the VAT had been introduced, and it was felt that GST was going to follow pretty soon, a few years after the introduction of the value-added tax. That it didn't happen, of course, is history, but that's what it was commonly believed. And that was the time when the international environment was benign, absolutely benign, and the Indian economy was developing pretty rapidly. It was post about 2005 that the international environment began to turn adverse. That's when the financial meltdown began to hit the rest of the world. Not that it hit India in that form, but it hit India in different forms, in the sense not because too many of the financial institutions of India were not plugged into global financial institutions which had bought the toxic assets which were floating around between the US and and Europe. But the economic consequences of that financial meltdown started hitting India in terms of orders, in terms of employment, in terms of exports, etc. That was roughly around the time when India was having another coalition government led by the Congress Party. But what seems to have happened was that in that coalition government, you had coalition partners which constituted the regional parties who began to exercise influence fairly disproportionate to their representation in the coalition government. For example, you had the Trinamool Congress or the RJD of Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav looking at the Railways Ministry and saying, railway, my turf, others lay off. On the other hand, well, you had the experience of the DMK, where Mr. Raja was handling the telecom portfolio. Again, my turf, lay off. You had the National Congress Party with Mr. Praful Patel at the helm, who was handling civil aviation. Again, the same story, my turf, civil aviation, others lay off. So to that extent, these coalition partners began to exercise that influence, which unfortunately the larger party, which was the majority party, seemed to be acquiescing, and I'll tell you the issues where it seemed to have acquiesced. Now, that's when each of these coalition partners had their own affiliations to the business interests that came along with them. And irrespective of the domain experience, the domain knowledge, or the domain capability of these business interests, the larger contracts began to be apportioned to them. So I may be a real estate company, but then I got a license for telecom. I may have been a company bringing out newspapers, but I was handed out a coal mine block. Similar examples began to roll out, and these companies, besides the fact that they did not have the domain knowledge, unfortunately became very heavily financially over-leveraged. They got into infrastructure space. Typically, infrastructure has a long gestation period. They borrowed from banks, largely public sector banks, who were only too happy and who were being encouraged to help economic development, to lend to infrastructure projects. Not a bad issue by themselves. But somewhere between the appraisal capability of these banks, somewhere between the proposal that was being given out by these companies for debt that they were wanting to take, from these banks, there was a mismatch. Huge amounts were borrowed. Huge amounts were borrowed and not necessarily put into the projects that they were being apportioned. Obviously, they did not have the domain knowledge. External environment became adverse. Things started getting unstuck. And the problem on the governmental side was that because of the differences that I was talking about between the coalition partners, large number of infrastructure projects who required statutory clearances from the government did not get those clearances in time. So ordinarily, when you prepare a detailed project report, you put in, say, 3 years, 4 years of the lead time. That lead time went into 6 years, 7 years, probably more. So even if you have the best of interests at heart, and the best of interests at heart in terms of delivering the project on time, that kind of time overrun leads to cost overruns, and hence the problems that this over-leveraging led to. Now, why I said the majority party acquiesced in the remarkable case of Spectrum itself, irrespective of what the licenses that the Supreme Court cancelled, recently all the set of people who had been indicted were acquitted by a trial court which was trying out these 2G spectrum allotment cases. And besides the issues of investigation and evidence, etc., the issue that the trial judge has put out is that the minister concerned brought everything onto the table and did inform the Prime Minister's office of all that he was doing. Now, whether the Prime Minister was not informed about it, whether the Prime Minister chose not to take action on it, is quite irrelevant. All that is being pointed out was that here was this coalition partner who said, this is what I'm going to do. Either the rest of the government shut its eyes towards it, or said, okay, that's in your domain, go ahead and do it. So that's where the regional parties' game plan starts. And regional parties typically tend to have only regional interests at heart. They may not necessarily have the national macro picture at heart, and hence things started getting unstuck, as I said earlier. And we are in a position that where we are today, where we have roughly about 8 to 9 trillion rupees stuck in bad loans with banks, and the debt that has been created. The other problem that India faced was that agriculture did not grow the way it had to be. It should have grown, the way conventional economies have grown. Industry and manufacturing has not grown the way it has grown. It's the services sector which is now contributing roughly 54% of the GDP to it. That has led to the kind of inequalities that we see today. Now, by itself, the economy has developed, but typically in countries of the kind, for example, Christine Lagarde, the IMF managing director, said, and I don't know where she got the data from, but she said that billionaire community in India has grown 12-fold in the last 15 years. But then she again has said, and she said this in 2015, and she again has said this in 2016, that as far as the US is concerned, and you called it the Gilded Age, US is concerned, of the income gains since 2009, the 1% business community has cornered 95% of the gains. Now, that's the kind of inequality in terms of a developed economy, and on the other side, in terms of a rapidly developing emerging economy. The inequalities persist. I guess that's a part of economic history. We will have to contend with how best these inequalities can be reduced, but economic growth has followed those kind of patterns. Now, relations between, you've talked about politics and business. If you have an electoral system of the kind that India follows, where electoral politics or elections per se have a huge amount of money being spent in it. Now, where does this money come from? We've had the remarkable experience of the Aam Aadmi Party, which seemed to say that we will run our party in the most transparent manner in which we will indicate our funding sources, and the funding sources will be individual contributions which have come to them, and they have actually come to them also from all around the globe. But that kind of money does not run a party of the kind that you see, nationalist parties of the kind that you see. The amount of money that the BJP has spent in UP, in the elections in UP alone, the kind of money that you've seen is being mustered for preparation of a war chest or a cash chest for general election next year, is not monies which can come by mere individual corrections. These monies can only come from corporate entities. So you had a whole season of scams, as you say in your book. How much of those scams, or how much of those scams created the billionaires that you are talking about? At least to some extent, these billionaires are benign billionaires. If you're talking about Antilla, the house in which Mukesh Ambani lives, it's rumored that to run the household, it requires 600 people. You may know it because you've been inside that. I haven't been inside that property.
I've never been inside. I don't think I'm ever going to get invited now.
You walk up and down the gate and you saw it. I see.
You sort of peered in from the back.
But no, one has seen it only from Pedder Road when one crosses. That's about all. But then it gives employment to 600 people, if it does. I don't know. The figures which have been talked about are anything from 200 to 600. God alone knows. I wonder even if God knows. But that's where it is. But the large number of billionaires who have been created who are underground, they are the ones who are not the benign kind. And they are the ones who contest elections, lose in the elections, but post the election are always richer than what they were before the election actually took place. Now, Supreme Court has come out with something exceedingly progressive, and Supreme Court says that if I were to contest elections, I have to file an affidavit which says what is my net worth along with my spouse and my immediate family members, so that my net worth comes out into public domain. Because invariably, when I fight the elections 5 years later, my net worth has undergone a substantial upward change. So once it comes out into public domain, then you can at least be questioned as to what was the source of gain in that net fund. So I think those are good things which are happening. But anyway, so that relationship between big business and electoral politics, I think, has come to stay. And to the extent that, lots of election commissioners, governments, lots of activists have talked about making elections funded by government funding of elections. But I don't think even if it comes about, it's really going to solve the problem, because today political parties happily declare the amount of money that they seem to have spent. But that does not give even a true fraction of the amount that is actually spent. So there has been an increase in the number of billionaires, but absolute poverty in India has gone down. And I think to that extent, credit has to be given to subsequent governments. Now, as far as the present setup is concerned, yes, banking is no better than what it was before they started. The season of scams, is it over? No, you really can't say. One large issue that is staring you in the face is what exactly happened in the deal, in the purchase of the Rafale jets with France. They say they won't declare the price, whatever it is, whether they declare or they don't declare. the fact remains that everybody seems to be becoming a parasite on the government exchequer. And that's where we need to, in some ways, put a check. And I think the best way to be doing that is, in some ways, bringing about an element of vigilance among the public at large, because the good thing that has happened from 2011-12, when Anna Hazare and company had stepped out into the country, is that there is an element of vigilantism within the citizen. Citizen has come center stage. Citizen has started asking the right kind of questions. And he is attempting to put anybody in authority, make him accountable. And I think that is a very happy development. And if we had to look at these issues holistically over the last 10 to 15 years, I think on the other than economic front, at the least, we have developed in a very healthy fashion. And I'm hoping that with this kind of vigilantism which has come out, willy-nilly governments will feel that they are sitting in glass houses, in glass cages, where each action of them is being seen and perceived from outside, and that any action or decision that they take will have to be accountable. They will be accountable for it. I think that's a happy development, and I think if we have to, in some ways, look to the future, we have to draw clues from the past, because we have to read from the tea leaves of the past itself. And I think as long as we can gain from it, right now is the time when probably the sun is shining, that we need to repair the roof that is in India. Thank you.
Thank you for those insights, Vinod, and especially for ending on that relatively happy note. May I turn to Professor Kudaisya.
Thank you. I must start with congratulating James on a very well-researched and nuanced book on India's new billionaires. I have a couple of notes, and I'm going to read through what I have to say. It's an important contribution to the limited corpus of writings on contemporary Indian capital. Though we have a fair amount of very good literature on the historical evolution of Indian capital, its history, its politics, its structure and strategy, we have little on contemporary capital. Thus, Billionaire Raj fills a major gap in our understanding of India since the 2000s. So many congratulations, James.
Thank you. It's very kind of you.
As a historian, I'm going to take you all back to 1948. The flamboyance and extravagance that which James has captured in his narrative is not a new dimension of Indian business. So let's look at the early years of independence. Ramakrishna Dalmia, whose group was, between 1947 and 51, one of the four largest business houses in the country, he went on a world tour with the sixth of his wives, a very young woman at that time, to promote a rather eccentric idea that he had of a one-world government. He met with important personalities all over the world and instituted 20 prizes in his name in different universities. Ramakrishna Dalmia had ambitions of being a major public figure. He had hoped and expected to be India's first finance minister, an idea he discussed with several leaders of the Congress party, but he was obviously snubbed. Dalmia also flirted with Hindu nationalism and patronized the campaign for a ban on cow slaughter. Dalmia had also recently been on a shopping spree, buying up factories and homes across India. He bought a number of sprawling mansions from departing Muslim aristocrats, as well as princes facing political eclipse after 1947. Many of these were in New Delhi, on Akbar Road, Sikandra Road, and Aurangzeb Road. Close friends with Jinnah, who he said had been his house guest. He also bought Jinnah's home in Aurangzeb Road at the time of partition, and immediately, in very Dalmia style, hoisted a cow protection flag on the house. Dalmia also bought a stable of newspapers in Hindi, Bengali, and English, including the Times of India. Dalmia was a Marwari from Rohtak in Punjab who had had a meteoric rise after making windfalls in speculative activity in silver in the bazaar at the time of the First World War. again at the time of the Second World War. In the 1920s and 30s, he had entered industry, but trading and speculation continued alongside. Dalmia's fortunes, however, came down as fast as they had risen. All these activities did not go well with the Nehruvian establishment. His large business empire ran into difficulties with charges of tax evasion and fraud, which were pressed against him in the late 1950s and early 1960s. In 1962, a special commission was appointed by Nehru. Dalmia was convicted and went to jail. It was apparent that Dalmia had used the managing agency system to manipulate financial bodies. The Indian state under Nehru could restrain and control someone like Dalmia. As James has shown, the present state is unable to do so. Corruption was not restricted to the Dalmia story. Nehru's first finance minister, Shanmugam Shetty, had to resign in 1948 August, exactly a year after the government had been formed. In 1947, an investigation had been ordered into allegations of income tax evasion of several business houses. Shetty was accused of showing favor to 4 business houses against whom correct income tax evasion cases had been filed. He withdrew their cases. These included Walchand Hirachand, the Birlas, Kasturbai Lalbhai, and Alagappa Chetty. Shanmugam Chetty was charged with withdrawing the cases. He was forced to resign, and this led to the first cabinet crisis in the Nehruvian government. Then again, a couple of years later, 1958, India's third finance minister, T.T. Krishnamachari, was involved in the famous Mundra scandal involving the state-controlled life insurance corporation. T.T. Krishnamachari was also forced to resign in February 1958, and the Calcutta-based Marwari trader and speculator Haridas Mundra was arrested. Since the 1950s and 60s, we also have a long history of business groups using banks to personal advantage. Many big business houses exploited growth opportunities through favorable access to bank loans and government permits. All these have been documented by the R.K. Hazari Committee report of 1966, the Mahalanobis Committee of 1964, the Monopolies Inquiry Commission of 1965, and the Industrial Licensing Committee of 1969. The crony capitalism that James tells us about has echoes in the past, but in scale it is perhaps new. What lies behind this? Of course, the lack of regulatory structures, loopholes in taxation laws, etc., and other reasons which Mr. Rai has so interestingly told us about. But what also lies behind this is a failure of partnership, a failure of the state to partner with business. There is a deeply flawed relationship between state and business in India, and it need not have been like this. In 1944, 8 remarkable businessmen and economists, including J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Kasturbai Lalbhai, Lala Shriram, Purushottam Das Thakur Das, then called Cotton King, the economist A.D. Shroff, civil servant Ardeshir Dalal, and John Mathai, later India's second finance minister after Shetty resigned, all authored a remarkable 90-page document called the Bombay Plan. This was an economic blueprint for independent India, a bold and ambitious plan to pull millions out of poverty. It was a roadmap which promised to double India's per capita income in 15 years, envisaged an increase of 130% in agricultural output, a 500% increase in industry, and a minimum standard of living for every individual. The Bombay Plan held out the promise of partnership between the Indian state and private enterprise. It was also a search for a capitalism with distinctive Indian characteristics. What were these characteristics? A planned model of economic development with an equitable partnership between state and private enterprise, with the state having a dominant role, at least in the initial stages, till a certain level of development had been achieved. It also embraced the idea of welfare and showed a strong commitment to the democratic process. The Bombay Plan represented the search for a new type of capitalism. It envisaged the compatibility of planning with capitalism, a middle path between central planning and the market, between state-owned enterprises and private enterprise. It sought a dualism with both private enterprise and interventionist Keynesianism harmonized in a development-oriented state. Unfortunately, this did not happen. As James says in a later page of his book, page 365 to be exact, India still needs to chart a hybrid economic model of its own. My final points. The many instances which James has highlighted about crony capitalism may lead an uninformed person reading the book to the conclusion that cronyism and rent-seeking is the most dominant feature of Indian enterprise. All this gives Indian capitalism a bad name, and I am no apologist or spokesperson for Indian capital, but as a historian, I must remind you that there are positive features of Indian business which account for the vitality and dynamism of the Indian economy. Consider, for example, the consistency with which old professional groups like the Tatas, the Birlas, the Lalbhais, the Bajajis, and others like the Bangars have performed in the post-liberalization environment. Then, consider the impressive rise of regional capital which Harish Damodaran's India's New Capitalists has captured. Think also of new entrepreneurs who have focused on the knowledge-based industries, the IT sector. Then there are the post-liberalization first-generation entrepreneurs who have entered pharmaceuticals and consumer-facing businesses. A recent study by Geeta Piramal, a recent article by Piramal, has shown that reforms have sharply impacted the nature of entrepreneurship. Knowledge-based businesses have seized the lead from agriculture-based industries. First-generation entrepreneurs now make up 36% of the 2016 top business list. Another 34% are second generation who have continued their interest in manufacturing. All this needs to be acknowledged in the story of Indian capital. Having said all this, I must again commend James for his thoughtful analysis, for highlighting deeply disturbing issues of growing inequality, and above all, for pointing out the need for urgent and pressing institutional and regulatory reform.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kudaisya, for this fascinating historical accounts. And it really is fascinating to also speculate on what might have been had the Bombay Plan been put into effect. But this counterfactual is something that most economists haven't had the guts to analyze.